Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, for God's glory and that of his kingdom. A man who has devoted his life to understanding these threats that we're facing, those that are particularly here at home and endangering our country, as well as the inspiration they take from foreign well, religious and other communities, is our first guest. His name is Robert Spencer. I'm very pleased to say he is a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy. He is a renowned author, including, among other things, of the history of Jihad, from Muhammad to ISIS. He is also the master of jihadwatch.org. It is a marvelous resource online brought to us by the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And we're very grateful for all of these good works and the chance to visit with Robert from time to time. Welcome back.
Good to talk to you, Frank, as always.
Thank you. Let me start, Robert, by asking you about this individual. Uh, Frank James is his name, who is now alleged to have been responsible for trying to kill an awful lot of people in a New York subway earlier this week. He is what has in the past at least been called apparently a black identity extremist. I'm told that term is no longer politically correct enough for the FBI, but um, give us a sense of this phenomenon of, well, for want of a better term, this black extremist cohort, and do they constitute, in your estimation, an actual serious threat here in the homeland?
Whatsoever. As a matter of fact, this man, Frank James, was on the FBI's terror radar up until 2019, when, after extensive interviews, it was said, he was cleared. Obviously, they made a mistake in this. And it's interesting that it was right around the same time that the feds started to concentrate on what Attorney General Merrick Garland, Joe Biden himself, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, and others have claimed that white supremacy is the biggest terror threat that the nation faces. So, right at the time when they started saying that these phantom white supremacists that we never actually see do anything were the biggest terror threat that the nation faces, they also began to de emphasize attention to black identity extremism. And so Frank James is let go, and now 10 people have been gravely wounded as a result. He is clearly somebody who was consumed by rage and hatred. He believed that America was systemically racist, which is exactly what the critical race theory propagandists say, and that he could never, as a black man, get a fair shake or have a decent life in America. And he even threatened that ultimately one day he was going to be violent, and he followed through on those threats. But this is just not something that's on the FBI's radar at this point. It seems that all their energies are devoted to this highly politicized attempt to, in the first place, portray all supporters of the former president as white supremacists, and then in the second place, to claim that white supremacists are, in every case, dangerous terrorists. It's really just an attempt to criminalize opposition to the left.
Political opposition,
Yeah.
indeed, and ignore in the process some threats that, well, they now call them racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, which is getting to a level of abstraction that's not necessarily terribly informative. Let me ask you about this violent extremism business, Robert, because as I said, you're one of our leading experts in this country on jihad and on Sharia and Sharia supremacism, which I think animates it, calls for it, requires it of faithful Muslims. I believe it was the Muslim Brotherhood that first advanced this idea that you mustn't use terms like jihad. Violent extremism is the preferred way of characterizing these things because that allows you to say, well, there's all kinds of violent extremists. Black identity extremism, you've asserted, is a serious problem here. Is jihadist extremism also, in your judgment?
It is, Frank. At Jihad Watch, I track regularly jihad activity, and I can tell you that on a fairly frequent basis, there are jihad plots in the United States. Generally, they are discovered, but there are also curious incidents, like, for example, in Seattle. Just recently, in recent weeks, there was a man who called 911 and he said, "I've committed a murder and it's on my account." And the operator says, "What do you mean it's on your account?" And he says, "I mean that I did it in the name of Allah." And then he explained that he'd been reading the Quran, and from the Quran, he got the idea that he had to kill this woman whom he killed. Now, that's a very strange case, but what's noteworthy about it is that the reporting about it has all for the has in the establishment in the Seattle Times and in the broadcast media in the Seattle area completely ignored what he said about his own motivations, because obviously it doesn't fit the media narrative. And this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. AP, Reuters, the New York Times, CNN, they are all committed to downplaying, whitewashing, ignoring outright jihad terror activity, which continues in the United States. And unfortunately, the federal law enforcement and intelligence apparatus seems just as committed to pretending that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I imagine that there is some connection between those two, that the law enforcement community and heavens knows, as you've documented on your pages, Robert, the insistence of the FBI reflexively, virtually immediately upon a terrorist incident taking place, some special agent in charge or another individual associated with the FBI is trotted out to say it's not terrorism. Well, what is it, in fact? And it turns out it's not lone wolves. It's not even known wolves, as in the case of this Frank James. It's somebody who is imbued with this idea that it is Allah's will that they will uh, perform jihad, and they are doing so freely and unfortunately often violently. Robert, let me ask you about one other piece of this, if I can. Um, Coming back to your point about the preoccupation with the so-called white supremacists, we had this week a very interesting and I think quite important verdict from a jury in Michigan about um, this case in which allegedly there was a plot by white supremacists to capture, kidnap, hold hostage, perhaps even murder the governor of Michigan. Turned out the jury didn't think that case was made. In two cases, they gave him acquittals. In two other cases, they got into a hung jury situation. What did you make of that? And most especially, if you would, the role that the FBI played in actually fostering this alleged crime.
That's what's most noteworthy about this, that it seems as if it would never have happened at all if it weren't for federal agents being involved trying to make sure that it did happen. And it's interesting to note in that connection that with the notorious so-called insurrection of January 6th, 2021, it has now been revealed after numerous denials and fact checks, so-called, that there were at least 20 FBI and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents embedded among the protesters, and presumably egging them on to go into the Capitol. So it seems as if in both cases, the FBI is trying to manufacture this threat that they claim is the biggest threat that America faces. And once again, it comes down to trying to criminalize ultimately political opposition that's completely
Political
legitimate.
opposition. All right, hold that thought, Robert. We're going to come back with another caper that we also want your considered opinion about. Two operatives picked up earlier this week in Washington, right after this.